Hello everyone, my name's Chris Johnson from the University of Tasmania, and the dogs that I want to talk about are livestock guardian dogs. These are dogs that protect livestock, and I'm interested in them for two reasons. One is that I think what they do is terrific, they're fantastic dogs. The other is that they might be able to help us conserve wildlife, and that's one of my main interests. So what is a livestock guardian dog? It's something like a Maremma sheepdog. This is a Maremma sheepdog working in northern Australia on a large sheep property. And what this dog does is remain with these sheep day and night through all of the seasons of the year, looking after them, to some extent leading them and keeping them together, but primarily protecting them from attacks by wild predators and from being stolen by thieves as well, if that was a possibility. Livestock guardian dogs have been used for a long time. Charles Darwin saw them when he was in Argentina, in South America. This is a nice quote from him. When riding, it is a common thing to meet a large flock of sheep guarded by one or two dogs at the distance of some miles from any house or man. I often wondered how so firm a friendship had been established. So good question. I mean, how does this bond between, this friendship between dogs and livestock begin, and how does it work? Two answers to that question. First is history. The historical part of it is that it's been happening for a long time. The practice by shepherds of using dogs to help protect their flocks goes right back to ancient Rome and probably before. It's many thousands of years old. And it used to be a traditional part of stock management in Southern Europe and Central Asia. The dogs weren't there to herd the stock, they were there to help care for them and help protect them. And they became so good at that through generations of breeding and management that they're as good as shepherds or even better. That practice, that tradition of using these guardian dogs with stock almost died out in the 20th century, but it's been revived. And they're now commonly used without shepherds in countries like Australia, where they're placed out with stock in the hope that they'll give protection. The second answer to the question of how this friendship develops is at the level of the individual animal, and it works through social development. Guardian dogs are prepared for their role in life by being placed with the livestock that they're intended to protect when they're little puppies at 8 weeks of age. And they do most of their growing up and their socialisation with livestock rather than with people, beginning with lambs, as in this case, and then eventually they graduate to more rambunctious and potentially, sort of rough ewes and wethers and rams, until they end up as an adult, confident in a paddock full of sheep and helping to look after them. So the research that I'm going to talk about has been done over quite a few years, mostly with Linda van Bommel. Linda van Bommel was a PhD student at the University of Tasmania. She's now a postdoc fellow. And we wanted to answer a few questions about guardian dogs, livestock guardian dogs in Australia. And the first is, how good are they? Do they achieve the task, accomplish the task of providing protection for livestock? And the short answer is yes, they do. We studied this by visiting farms, talking to farmers, collecting data where we could, and also studying the behaviour of the dogs. And the simple result is that they can reduce attacks on livestock almost completely where they're properly managed, even in cases where before the deployment of the dogs, the mortality of stock due to predation was so high that the farmers were about to go out of business. And if you want to read more about this, there's a really neat publication it's essentially a book length manual on use of guardian dogs in Australia, but it's available for free as a download on the internet. Just search for guardian dogs, best practice management for the use of livestock guardian dogs. So they're good at their job. The second question we wanted to answer is, well, how do they do it? What's their behaviour, and how does their behaviour achieve this protection? And we studied this in a few ways. One was by getting detailed information on where the dogs go day and night by fitting GPS collars to them. And this is a group of Maremma sheepdogs working in a high country farm in southern Victoria. And each one's got a tracking collar with a GPS on it, so we can tell exactly what they're doing, even minute by minute during the day. And we were tracking stock as well. And then we wanted to know what the dogs do when they sense that predators are close or that an attack might be imminent. And we tested that using experiments where we did playbacks of dingoes howling. You can't see it probably, but That's a hidden speaker there that broadcasts the sound of dingoes during the night when we set it to do that. And that's Linda, my PhD student, putting out a dingo urine trail so that she can test how the Marimas responded to that. And the short answers to all this are that the dogs spend most of their time actually with their stock, but they also move over quite large areas. And these dogs, some of them in particular, could have ranges that were several thousand hectares covering the entire farm, a much bigger area than the sheep themselves actually use in most of their grazing. So they're essentially managing quite a large area themselves. The second thing is that they're very, and most people knew this, they're noisy and they make their presence known by putting out urine marks all over the place. So they're advertising to predators that this is a place that's occupied by another predator, in this case, a big, confident dog, that might be quite dangerous if you got too close to it. And then the third thing we learned is that some of the dogs at least will actually try to exclude predators from those large areas. So it's as if they're treating the farm as their territory that they will defend. And we tested this by doing some of these playbacks that simulated the incursions of dingoes on those areas. And we showed that even if you put a playback a long distance from the sheep, some of the dogs will go out and investigate and challenge. Interestingly, some of the others stay back and herd the flock together to make sure that it's really well protected. And if there's lots of dingoes around, or if they think there are lots of dingoes around, they might even move the stock back into the stockyards to hold them all in one place so that they can better protect them there. So this kind of role differentiation turns out to be really important as well. So that's useful to know that they will operate over quite a large area and they will attempt to keep predators out. The other side of this that we know from literature in other parts of the world is that the predators tend to avoid the areas that are occupied by the dogs for the good reason that they sense risk if they go into those areas. So they just keep out. And that avoidance means you get quite a nice separation of the areas used by the sheep with their dogs and the areas used by predators for hunting. And that gives a kind of a balance of coexistence over large landscapes, which is a very useful thing. It also means that the sheep don't experience the stress of sensing the approach of predators because the predators are being kept away. So if these areas are being, if predators are avoiding these areas, and that's reducing their impact on stock, that also reduces the conflict between the value and the interests of livestock farming and the need for the predators to survive somewhere. And that's something that we can use in conservation. The best example of where this is currently being applied is in Africa, particularly in Namibia and the Republic of South Africa, where one of the most successful programs for protecting cheetah now involves using livestock guardian dogs. Cheetah are still quite widespread in Southern Africa, but they're threatened and their population's in decline. The main threat is retaliatory killing by farmers who have suffered attacks on their livestock. So once farmers have had some of their livestock killed, they're very, very inclined to keep an eye out for predators and shoot any that they see. So cheetahs and leopards and others get shot by farmers, and that mortality is too high. They can't sustain it. So these programs are experimenting and it's worked. So they're now doing at large scale placements of guardian dogs with farmers to protect their stock. The farming system here, or the grazing system, involves stock being kept in corrals at night so they can be closely protected, and the dogs do that guarding of the stocks in their yards at night. And then during the day, the stock are allowed to go out over open ranges and do their feeding and watering, and the dogs actually lead them out. So there's no shepherding involved in this for them. Primarily, it's the dogs who are doing the shepherding. And so they keep the stock together and they also provide protection, which may be predominantly due to avoidance by wild predators. So that minimises the direct overlap between the wild predators and the dogs. It also means that because farmers aren't having their stock killed anymore, they've got less motivation to kill predators and their attitudes change. So that's improved predator conservation and maybe the salvation of cheetahs in the world. So we've seen some examples of guardian dogs, Maremma sheepdogs again, helping save wildlife in Australia as well. And there's a famous one at this place called Middle Island on the coast just off Warrnambool in the south coast of Victoria, where there's an isolated breeding colony of little penguins in decline because of predation by foxes and wild dogs who could get across at low tide and would kill them in large numbers. Someone had the bright idea, a farmer who was running free-range poultry and had moremas protecting his chooks and his ducks. If moremas can protect chooks and ducks, they can probably protect penguins as well. So they took the dogs out onto the island and found that even if they had the dogs out there for short periods, a couple of times a day, walking around the perimeter of the penguin colony, that was enough to keep the foxes away at night. So it's again, this avoidance working to provide protection. And that's now an ongoing program that's been quite successful. You could call it an incredible true story. So of course there's a movie about it. And that's had the unfortunate side effect actually of sort of romanticising the maremma a little bit. And some people, when they're a bit now overused as a companion animal or a household pet, when they're really not suited for that purpose. So a third case where we might be able to use livestock guardian dogs, maremmas again, in wildlife conservation is in protecting bandicoots from foxes. And this is a project that is still underway. I'm involved in this again with Linda Van Bommel and Zoos Victoria. What we want to do is to find out whether we can make certain areas safe for bandicoots by placing dogs in those areas. The idea being based on the penguin experience that the presence of the dogs will tend to keep foxes away. And the dogs themselves are much less likely to hunt bandicoots because they're interested in protecting sheep and bandicoots don't attack sheep. So we put a few sheep out. The sheep are there really for the purpose of deploying the dogs. The dogs operate over these trial sites of several hundred hectares. And eventually what we want to do is put bandicoots into those and test whether the presence of the dogs allows the bandicoot populations to survive. So that's coming along nicely, but we don't have final results to report. Another day perhaps. And I think that's all for me at the moment. So I'll stop talking and I hope I'll have a chance to answer any questions that people might have. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.